Hello everyone, today we talk about Indo-European theology and more specifically the root sound k. K, C depends on how you, eventually our same writing has tended together with the spoken to differentiate between certain sounds as actually the single most important phoneme in Indo-European language. This is something that, as we will see now, exists within the very fabric of our own language. We've seen it also in the previous episodes, but you can almost sense how the hard k sound, k sound, is incredibly resounding within our language. It is in my native tongue. It's also probably even doubled to an extent for reasons now we're not going to explain. And that expresses actually the most original, foundational concept of the celestial vault. You see, celestial actually coming from chylum, that is connected with this hard k. As we've seen in previous episodes, the Indo-European worldview is molded on the basis of the astronomic movements. Right, and the C, the k, is the most descriptive of such dynamic. First and foremost, it is the ultimate heavenly dimension. The sky, this was never still. We have the K sound because in the European mentality conceived the celestial vault as moving, because the only unmoved mover is God. And in this sense, the vault, however, is somehow the closest to divinity. Its cycles are, long. Mostly if you look at the stars in particular. There are other actors here, such as, of course, the sun and the moon, that we will see being connected with this partially. And they correspond to the firmament as the gradually, in fact, firmer achievement in heaven of those souls that gain those levels, probably closer to God. So in actually a very familiar representation, especially if you think about Dante's heaven and so on, it's all rooted in the original universal worldview. The sky was never still, all right, and this is in and of itself the measure of the imperfection of the lower nature, right? So not much creation per se, but how this manifested in the fall from the divine. Only the divine is absolutely fixed, and we'll see now how this connects with K and this cyclical. In fact, the etymology of cyclical coming from the root phoneme. Movements are essentially the most sacred, the ones that come the closest to that true firmament. So from the moment the first light broke across the primeval waters that I also discussed recently in the Na, as well as the Ka, and so the interaction with the light, the necessity of the divine, virile connection with the lower nature as the only mean to its elevation and overall completion, the vault above turned like an immense bronze wheel. This is the view that we get from heaven. And the divine power, shining, distant, terrible in its beauty, when we talk about God's plural, this actually refers to the subordination of beings coming back to the one or having fallen from the one that earned their place in the firmament. So just like the saints, again, in the various levels of heaven in medieval tradition, this was the actual point of arrival way before Christianity in all the traditional Apollonian religions that took over the world. And with a large dominance effect of the Indo-European one, at least as a much more vividly impressed compared to any other in today's world, culturally speaking. That's a debate we will have at some, not a debate, a discussion to stress how much of today's world achievement all over the globe are fundamentally product by product of an Indo-European information of other cultures as well, including the ones that were never sort of conquered, like the Chinese, even though some say that at the origins it's very plausible that China was established in a heavenly imperial sense by some early Indo-European conqueror, but this is not really the video for discussing this. And in fact, when you look at, and this is also to stress how much the concept of polytheism is a whole pile of BS, when you look at Indo-European theology, you realize that the gods, as shining, distant, terrible in their beauty, as the stars, kept only to the rim of this immense bronze wheel. They were not the center of it, right? If you think, as unfortunately we've been told in school to a degree, that there was a polytheistic world with some random beings that existed for no reason, each with their own prerogative, and against a unitary, a divine power, just know that, again, it's probably better if you go to somewhere to study actual history of religion, maybe in a university, but not necessarily, even unfortunately at this point, anymore. The center belongs only to God and the single primal power. By the way, I frankly, at this point, stopped even digressing too much on how we know these things. I mean, video after video, I'm just showing you, as I'm going to do now, on the basis of the sources, this was the univocal worldview. Even the civilization of the mother, the Pelasgian beliefs that were much more chthonic, telluric, and so on, and presented therefore an alter ego of Uranian, Apollonian virility of the divine, were themselves at most believing that everything stemmed from Gaia Mater, from the Mother Earth, right? And this was, however, still an important, it's not an equivalence, there's not a dualistic sort of relativism even among these latter peoples regarding the relation with the heavenly dimension. In fact, when here banally we're talking about Indo-European history, which is not so banal, but when these conquerors came around, these cultures that were, as you understand, like worshipping actually pretty universal concepts because they are archetypal. They were never separated between one another, not just recognize one another, but also place themselves in a very specific, unequal relation, in any case, that mirrored some absolute standard, right? That's also why, for example, Gnostic separatism, dualism, and so on, do not really find room in Catholic tradition as we have countlessly defined it, and or are essentially an over absolutization of a deflective principle, which is in fact the lying one, the sort of the one that denies, not that creates, that lays in the chthonic, in the darkness, and the antivirai, which is considered as properly also the only creator of the lower domain as well, right? Now, the chthonic dimension does not have an answer to that, right? And the Pelasgians could not really deny the existence of these other gods. They just acknowledged them, and it just sort of the conquerors had a much more concrete, if anything, for the accomplishment itself, idea of how the hierarchical relation worked. So going back to God, that unmoving center belonged to the One, who is older than motion, and therefore every mortal act that would reach the divine had first to imitate their circling. This is the root concept of why, as we will see now, in Indo-European language, the root of all this celestial meaning is obviously sacred, because the entire language was understood as is spoken by gods, all right, by beings that had fallen from divinity and that were, in this case, closer to the same, ideally, and that therefore informs hierarchically, just as we described, the entire rest of the universe, provided with its framework and its sort of metaphysical precondition, but also contained, because that's the function of these beliefs, the traditional wisdom too, by ritual performance, come back to that celestial dimension by literally imitating the same astronomic movements that are ignited by God. Interestingly enough, aside from the etymology of ignited that I already made a video on for Ignis and Agni and all the actual descent of the Holy Ghost and divinity across the world, according to Indo-European religions, the idea of the unmoved mover, and so the stark conceptual separation between being as absolute and therefore immoved, right, and the becoming, so the generating dimension, which we live as just an hologram, as an evanescent, increasingly dissipating, in fact, model of the one, is stemming from, right? And in this sense, because of its own craving, not because of divine perfection, otherwise we would not be fallen, we would not be mortal, etc., right? The straight line for mortals to reach, to reunite with the divine, which is the ultimate goal of the entire tradition, is the path of so-called beasts. The circle is the path of men who remember, right? In the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language, the unmoving axis of the, for example, the war chariot. We're talking now about the war bands. I also made some videos about beast warriors and so on and how to achieve that. But there is a very beautiful ideation within probably the later development of chariot warfare among the Indo-Europeans and the greatest peak of their expansion. The notion that the unmoving axis, right, or the axle properly of the war chariot itself bore the name Hax. Remember, these videos are about linguistics as much as religion. We can essentially draw the parallel between these two dimensions to prove the actual existence of an Indo-European religion, for that matter, through its own language, only in this way, right? There are people making videos, also sending them to me, saying, but look, this guy here says that there isn't actually like an Indo-European religion or language, whatever. These people do not enter in this world, all right? They just let this to the specialists and say, well, basically, since today nobody tries a more comprehensive explanation of the war because of reasons that frankly are not even tied to this topic, whoever tries to have a more unitary approach of this all, it must be, wrong, or it's written in the same language. And it's not like you can say, well, but we don't know what the language originated. It doesn't matter. What the meanings that are connected with that are clear as day. They are Kenningars. They're all encoded within one another. You cannot separate them. It's not a hypothesis. This is pure modernistic skepticism. It melts away in front of the basic evidence that I'm here, even just purporting. I'm not even an expert in Indo-Europeistics, as you know. I do else. However, just by simple browsing, it seems like that there is, at the very least, a traumatically striking pattern for which every single element of this matches in the sort of, together also with all the religious views that we know stem from these peoples, up to our own very day, our own very religion, regardless of what lesser people think, Christianity having nothing to do with that, not understanding what the meaning of Catholicism is, as a matter of fact, in a pre-Christian sense, which also has, again, I always say it, one of the few things that Christian priests themselves still tell you explicitly, that Catholicism predates Christianity for a very specific reason, not just in a biblical sense, in a Veterotestamentary way. Also, obviously, because that is meant to encode the wall from that direction. But when you confront, in fact, with these other ones, you understand that it only integrates them. It's not different. It's just like a different attitude of different people to different concepts. That's a talk we will have to have more explicitly at some point, but still, the meaning is there. And so, what we just said, the ax, meaning axis, pivot, right? The concept of God being literally the fixed, unmoved mover. The axle, of course, like wheels, right? It revolves, but it doesn't move as far as that dimension is concerned. Naturally, God has an infinite dimension, and therefore the concept is that if you were to see this axle, covering the entire possible vectors within space, there would be a single point in the center that is completely unmoving, but causing the movement of everything else, right? And it's a bit like, if you look, I don't know, those accelerated sort of videos of the polar star, etc. You see the sky vault circling all around and giving you exactly that same kind of concept that obviously inspired the same astronomers of antiquity, also because you have to imagine these people spent half of their existence looking at the stars, unless they slept, of course, which hopefully they did, for providing us with such a coherent picture. But it's very well known, and it's also very much tied to the same natural evidence. Axis pivot. You have the Hittite hisha, pole axle, the Latin axis, axle, the Old Irish ash, as a matter of fact, that is axis, the Sanskrit uksha, axle, the Avestan asha, cosmic order pivoting on the axis, the Hellenic axon, axle, Old Church Slavonic ossi, axis, Tocharian axi, wheel hub, all preserving the laryngeal initial root that designated the motionless pole around which the sky wheel, the hartus, the turning wheel, and Sanskrit rata, chariot, Avestan rata, Latin rota, right, to rotate comes from that. Old Irish roth. They're all, do you understand how they're all the same identical language? Lithuanian ratas, Old High German rad, all from red to run in circle, revolved without cease. This is the most absolutely metaphysically foundational concept of Indo-European theology, worldview, universal belief. All right? It's striking as much as self-evident in language. And you understand, especially when such similarities exist, that everything was present at the root. Right? It's absolutely ridiculous to presume that all these languages, for some, I don't know, all at some point got from one another after the inception of the Indo-European sort of people's gradual separation in branches and so on, eventually gotten, right? This is one of the single most foundational concepts of Indo-Europeistics, the unmoved mover, the center. When Thomas Aquinas was writing a much more sort of Aristotelian, modern, secular idea of the unmoved mover, this is the same identical concept that existed encoded in the very languages that we speak. Did you know this about axis, as a matter of fact? Well, here you do. And the sky wheel, those artus, right, the turning wheel that is present in all these Indo-European languages. Long before the first stone was dragged upright or the first fire kindled in a ring of earth stones that we also recently discussed in the video about the Vedas and also the battle axe culture, in particular the megalithic one and so on, the priest, because this is the original, already the megalithic thing is a modern secular thing compared to probably sheer divine power, the priest felt the compulsion in his bones. He must walk the boundary sunwise once, thrice, 9 times. The Holy Trinity is all there. We've seen it in many videos. Until the air itself grew heavy with presence. Remember, I made multiple videos on the traditional meaning of rites. It is by essentially imitating here, straightforwardly, the cosmic movement that the same can provide you with the Holy Ghost, the Sacrum Imperium, and so world domination. Naturally, as I just said, we're talking a fallen dimension, so this is a right as a mean to an end that must mostly operate by divine media, as the priests that at this point are also leaders were. And that is supposed to more sort of geometrically show, in parallel with astronomic movements, that if you imitate divinity, here also in a metaphorical sense, as unmoved mover, a guy that just by sheer providence controls, molds the entire world at his own will through ubiquity and so on. We've seen it also recently in the video about the Bamberger Reiter, as a matter of fact, in 13th century Germany. You can truly bring the new age of order on this fallen world and basically re-elevating it to the absolute being. This sun-wise circuit called Soulius De, from the root, you can immediately understand where this leads, that is namely properly placing of the sun, right, in Proto-Indo-European, appears in the sort of autonomously developed branch as Sanskrit Savya, which means left hand sun-wise circuit. The Avestan Aurea, left belonging to the sun, the Hellenic Eunomos, which means left auspicious, the Latin sinus, which means, as you know, fold, circuit to the left. The Old Irish Dessel, which is sun-wise turn. The Old Norse Söl, which is sun-wise. The Lithuanian Saule Grinsis, solstice turning, all from the root sevel, which is sun plus de, that is to say, to place, to turn. All right. So this is essentially the same motion of the rising sun that we explained also as far as sacred royalty is concerned, the Sol Invictus, that, as we also countlessly explained, wasn't sort of some oriental late antique thing. It existed in archaic Europe all over the place. The same motion, essentially, that made the sacred fire drill, the Ignis Hax, that is, so the Ignis Axe, the fire of the axis, right? In Sanskrit, Agni, Latin Ignis, we've seen it again in an entire video. The Hittite Anjas, the Umbrian Pyr, which means fire, hence from pyre, for example, spin upon its fixed point until the sky god's spark leapt forth. Right? So in other words, this is properly the advance of the sun across the celestial vault. And this was the most important movement, obviously, because it simply explained, decoded, defined the rise of life, of glory, of domination, of triumph, right? And it bore itself like an enormous, auspicious and sort of victorious and honorable meaning for the earth, a new cycle to be rebooted, new life, right? New divine power, reinvigorating the world in the process. Right? I would like to stress, by the way, when you look at these etymologies, how, of course, they could gradually distance themselves phonetically within each Indo-European language, right? We've seen here different, and some are strikingly sort of more or less faithful to the others. For example, the Hittite maintained the Han Zash, so literally the Ignis Hax double root, and also just because we find it properly formulated as a concept. In Latin, we don't have that, but the root Ignis is sort of much more connected with the fire one, as the Sanskrit. Of course, it's mostly through Latin, through Italic languages, the Vedic texts, and Hellenic, that we reconstruct the plenitude, especially of the earlier Indo-European languages in a very comparative way. And we've explained how and why, right? In the Eastern-Western branch context is striking, etc., but mostly there is some important reinjection that brought to the establishment of the Hellenic. The Roman civilization was fairly recent in time and coming straight from at least a pretty sort of Central European core land of where, the majority of sort of Indo-European, at least those stronger Europeans that would eventually, in fact, break through in the south. It was all Indo-Europeanized at some point, will reinject the core concept. In the tongue of the Eastern seers, this walking forward into the turning was known as the prak. Sanskrit prak, from pra plus ak, that is probably the prayer that moves ahead into the circle of light. Because, as we'll see better now, it wasn't just about mimicking the movement, but of course the same voice, the same divine sound, the sacred utterance of those words that in and of themselves echoed the rise of the sun, right? The pleading voice flung spurling upward, known as vak. In Sanskrit, once again, the root is va plus ak. The same motion bent the body low in reverence during the ritual. The Sanskrit anchati, to bend, to curve, ancha, that this actually came from the same K, right? So it could be read also in a different way later. This is completely normal. As we said at the beginning, K, C, it really depends. Ancha meaning curled, anchita meaning curved, bent, so that essentially the spine became a living crescent moon, the bowed head, the second moon touching the dark earth, the arms sweeping like the wings of the crane that flies forever in rings above the marsh, right? The crane itself, for this reason, sacred dancer of the sky wheel, was named Gerno, right? This because this was literally mimicking the bending of the faithful. Remember here also the cross symbolism for that matter, the wings, the concept of elevation. Gerno, crane, Indo-European language being connected with Sanskrit, krauncha, Hellenic geranos, Latin grus, Old High Germanic kranu, kranuk, Lithuanian gartness, the Old Church Slavonic zeravi, because they are all connected. Welsh garan, all from the Proto-Indo-European root ger, right, which means specifically, you would wonder where I go with this, but it's all very specifically defined as the Proto-European root ger, which means to cry hoarsely while circling, right? Hence the name of the crane and the obvious connection with the heavens. This is true at large for other migratory birds that were sacred for partaking this astronomic cycles, because for half year they would literally disappear into heaven, going into that other dimension. Therefore, we're still today, think about the cranes, how they are auspicious, bringer of life, a new fortune. If you wonder where the entire myth comes from, it comes entirely from this. And you understand how it belongs to all languages here: Sanskrit, Hellenic, Latin, Old High German, Lithuanian, Old Church Slavonic, Welsh, and more. The crane is the very bird whose wedge-shaped flocks trace the spiral migration routes that the Indo-European tribes themselves followed from the Phonetic steppe, and whose tribal sunwise dance around the dying hero is still attested in the Vedic Krauncha and the Thracian Geranos dance at Delos. This is also incredibly beautiful. For one side, you know that the crane is also a Christian symbol to an extent, and right? As we will see now, the K root word is actually connected with horses as well, and there is the sense that their cycle is obviously reflecting divine perfection, the astronomic movement, but in this sense, essentially revolving around the divine. Why does the crane dance around the dying hero in these triple circles? This is the Trismegistus. This is essentially the idea that the guy who is at that center is divine and his soul is ascending to heaven. That's also why during the discourses you will see now the equites and the k there comes from the root k, in the sense circled around the pyre that we've seen before also in Umbrian, as a matter of fact, of the emperor. And so being connected with fire, the sacred fire as well, and the ascent of the heaven. So, and the triple circle has to do, of course, with the Indo-European tripartite, which is an actual thing, and recurs in its, in fact, theological numerology. The circling is also expressed by the servant girl who glides silently around her master carrying water or fire. This is the ancilla in Latin, and etymology stems exactly from this circling movement, because of course the ancilla, as here the female element, the chthonic one, is the bear, if anything, of the womb, of the seed where the master, where Godfather plants, in fact, the further divine. And she recognizes, therefore, as a servant, the role of her master as divine, so metaphysically superior. In fact, in Latin, this ancilla is literally she who moves around, preserving the old Indo-European ak motion tending to circle. And before, remember, in Sanskrit, we have the various prefixes and ak, of course, stands for the motion tending to circle. So being at the very foundation of all these root words. The same root, these are, when we talk roots here, it's all Proto-Indo-European, so it's the archetypal word here. The same root, hank, Proto-Indo-European, means to bend, to circle. And it yields the Hittite hank, to bow, to bend, the Sanskrit anka, to curve, to hook, the Hellenic onkos, which means to bend, the Latin uncus, which means hook, as a matter of fact, the Old Irish icon, which is necessity, that which bends one, right? There's a lot of Old Irish, because naturally we would like to know much more about the older Celtic language, but to an extent we're not so documented as for the later, at least Old Irish literature that provided this for us. We have also the Armenian Ankh, which means corner, the Tocharian B Enk, which means to seize by circling, right? The Tocharians are, very famous. I made some videos about them, mostly from a military point of view, but you can always go check who they were, also tied with their religious views that they were incredibly self-aware about, even up to very late times, so they were relatively isolated. Interestingly enough, the water-carrying ancilla circles exactly as the Hittite priestess Hinkat, which was known as this is what the name means, offering bearer in Hittite, from the Indo-European matrix. So regarding the Latin ancilla, which when you learn Latin, ancilla is one of the easiest words from the first declension. You can, you wouldn't think much of her because you say she's a servant, but there is actually a deep metaphysical concept in the Latin language about her, because she's the one who's offering sacred water to her master. We've seen recently in the video again about what is the sacred nature of the waters, right, and how the master can dignify them, can transfigure them as the most chthonic element, right? And so you have in the Hittite religion the priestess, who is essentially having the same etymological headman of the Latin ancilla as an an offer bearer more in particular, as a vessel, as a vehicle, right? Remember, in this sense, also the virgin vessels that were in Rome controlling fire because they were so, in fact, pure as virgins that the incredibly radically patriarchal, virile, Uranian dimension of Roman civilization trusted them, as they were already transfigured by the greatness of the Romans. And this Hittite priestess, Incat, also performed the ritual circuit of the altar before bearing the offer before the sacrifice, because that was inherently sanctifying, right? The Trinity recurs obviously everywhere. Now, to stand in the presence of the holy is to become part of the willing. That's the deeper metaphysical concept, because, as we've seen, God is essentially the axle around which all the rest of this great cosmic will revolves, and therefore the only way, and the most intense way to approach the divine is to be part of this willing, or at least to be increasingly tied to it, right? And this is naturally more a coming back, because as we've seen, the more you go toward the fringe of this, the more you actually move, the more you become, and so the more you deteriorate. So this circling is, however, bringing you essentially to the altar, to the sacrifice, and so to the meeting point with the divine. The eye itself moves in tiny circles when it truly beholds. Sanskrit chi, right? Chi noti, to notice, to observe by moving around, right? The older Hellenic ki, or ku as well, later kinein, because again, words change, and kinein already tells you, synetic. That's what actually the root provided with this sense of inherent motion, connected with energy, which is in fact the divine one. In Latin, instead, it literally defined our term circa, right? Circum, circueo, which means to go around, circulor, to form a circle, circus, circle, circulus, small circle. These are all born from the same root that first meant to move around, right? And you understand how central they still are to our languages, right? Kinetic, circa, etc. Even to notice. Like if you look at the Sanskrit chi noti, it's not that distant from Latin as well, in our understanding of to notice in English, as a matter of fact. Then we have the root kvel, which means to turn, to revolve. This is continued in Hittite quel, to turn around, Sanskrit charati, to move about, Avestan chariti, to wander, the Hellenic pelomai, to be, to move, which came from kelomai. So sort of, you understand where this is all from. Again, you would say, but it doesn't sound like it, but it does. Like we know from the linguistic root that it does. Naturally, there are some linguistic debates regarding, for example, this term, but it's kind of obvious. If you, again, we don't get now into the enormously complex philological and linguistic issues, but here the examples are clear, in fact, as the sky. The Latin colo, which means to till by circling. And this is very interesting because colo, as you know, is it's a very foundational word in Roman anthropology, and so it's the idea of the farmer, because colo means to cultivate. That's where the term cultivate comes from. And this originally was in the root word connected by the idea of circling. It's essentially when Romulus traced the Pomerium, right? Plowing was obviously not a thing of the Indo-European conquerors. These men had, as we've seen, they were masters, they had serfs. But the idea that by one action, by going around a perimeter, like in the foundation of Rome, and establishing that as a sacred, recognizing that as a sacred parallel of the heavenly world, is exactly where the term colo, culture, to cultivate, etc., comes from. This is incredibly important. This is our language. Like, we speak these very words, and they contain this very matrix. Equally, the Old Irish kul, which is circle, the Old Norse vel, which means wheel. It doesn't require any explanation. The Lithuanian kalas, circle. The Tocharian kalp, to turn. Obviously, the sacred wheel chariot of the sun god could not be missing in this mythology as well as vocabulary. In fact, the term for the sacred wheel chariot of the sun god is this composite. There are two words, respectively composite by other two roots, which is the Sewelios duos. So the Sky Father Sun, actually, this is what it means. And that's all the solar symbolism we'll see now, right? And you find, of course, this everywhere. You have it in Sanskrit, Surya, the Hellenic Helios. It comes from Sewell, as a matter of fact. The Latin Sol, the Old Irish Sul, Old Norse Sol, Lithuanian Saule, all from the Proto-Indo-European root sevel, which is sun, with the divine suffix yos. From there is an elision, and that stands from duos. From this patient encircling arose the healer himself, because this guy had literally the vivifying power of the sun. In fact, we have Sanskrit Chikitsaka, which means physician. Medical science is Chikitsa, right? From kit, extension of ki, which is literally the one who circles again and again until the hidden cause is discovered. That's basically the root word of this Sanskrit term, interestingly enough. It's somebody who tries, and at that point to fix life, so to give life, to rejuvenate, or at least to preserve what it stemmed from the divine. The same motion sharpened the mind to a point. The Latin acus, needle, aquo, to sharpen, acer, sharp, keen, acutus, sharpen, pointed, acumen, point, sting, summit, all descend from the Indo-European ac, which stands to set encircling motion that ends in a point. All right. The reason why this is understood as a sharpened point is that basically that this would be the piercing point of the axis that is preserved in the idea of the cosmic needle, ac, the sharp point, axis point, as we've seen before. In words like Sanskrit ashri, corner, edge, the Hellenic acme, which is literally the point, right, is the higher point, as we know, which is the higher point of the sun in the celestial vault, and so also the central place of the sun in the celestial vault. The Latin acus, as we've said, the Old Church Slavonic oscilla, needle, the Old Irish eir, point, and the Germanic spear god, Wotanats, whose name derives from vet, which stands for to spin in frenzy. This is incredibly interesting. We made lots of videos about Germanic religion, Germanic warfare, and we know how central the spear is. In fact, Gungnir, forge at the still center of the universe, is not just in the sense Odin's own spear, but it's the one around which the Turmolos war bands gather. This is very important to understand. There is something surely more individually meant, like, I don't know, in Tacitus you have those German tribesmen evaluating the youth, making them run into the spears to see who was able to avoid getting impaled in them. And surely this was connected with broader sort of athletic feats that likely had a lot to do with the capacity of the spear to confer any power, capability in terms of movement, of agility to the warrior. But it also literally means the fact that Odin at the center is basically the unmoved mover, right? There were some peoples, as you know, also again in Tacitus Germania, that were evaluated to be so militarily experienced, so wise, which has the same etymology of video in Latin, which is essentially providential, that they could foresee the future. At least they were revered. Tacitus explains in a different way, but you understand even from that text, so that they didn't have really to fight anymore. As some younger ones, they had to prove themselves. And the fact that the concept of point stands in Wotanats is connected with the fact that these war bands were pinned around Odin at the extremes were the more mobile ones. In other words, were the lighter elements. The wolves were the ones who literally spin in frenzy. The closer you came to Wotan, the calmer, the wiser, the more sort of all-knowing and powerful. They didn't even need to be like a youthful sort of beast warrior, Unmoved or whatever, had to prove himself in the front ranks, to go back and forth, to spin in frenzy, as a matter of fact, to go back and forth to skirmish the enemy battle lines. At that point, he had to stand in basically everyone around, in front of his path and around it, of course, is Midgard, is world order, so to say. This is incredibly beautiful etymology as well, right? And even the and it's important here, you understand that the etymology of Wotanats is not the one associated with K, but the sense that the movement, that this was a spinning frenzy, is directly connected with the Gugner, that whoever holds it is still at the center. And so this is, again, incredibly relevant. Even the reaching arm is part of the wheel, in fact. The Hellenic brachion, the Latin brachium, arm, both preserving the old guttural that Latin later softened before back vowels, and in fact had to do as such with the K. The same goes for Bacchus, literally the Hellenic god, the Latin Bacchus. So this Thracian storm god, whose very name echoes the circling frenzy of the possessed as well, right? Because of his, again, Dionysian and Chthonic, more like the wolf, etc. This sort of fringe element that had to enact, right? Had to rise the darkest spirits to eventually, for the hero to eventually tame. I described the role of the Dionysian, so of this Bacchic element in the fire, where in the path where the fire of death blazes. That, by the way, was very much connected in this sense with the blood sacrifice, because in order to enter the war band, you had to kill someone, or you were ritually exposed to sometimes even the ritual killing of one element of the war band every once in a while, to show that you did not exist as a being, you were just part of the higher one, right? And so for the sake of God, your life was completely worthless, at least as a separated one from the wall. This, again, loads the entire meaning of European culture and identity in incredible fashion. The name Beg, to rage in circle, appears in the Phrygian Bagaios, Zeus Bagaios, the Thracian Zbelsordos, and the Illyrian Bakith, while the Maenads Thyrsos staff terminates the pine cone, piece point to the axis, the Sanskrit Pisha, pine cone, the Hellenic Putulon, pine cone, Thyrsus tip, the Latin pinus, the pine. The exact replica of the world tree's apex were the sky wheel pivots, because, of course, the axle of the world was also the sacred tree of the world, right? A bit like the Irminsul, a bit like the same, I don't know, the oak on the top of the Capitoline Hill in Rome. That was the foundational axis of the world, and of course this was God himself. Remember the tree, by the way, circling. Remember the video about the medieval slumbering monarchs of German folklore? How many times does the beard of all these rulers encircle around the table's leg before the end time, and this rule reawakens thrice? We've seen it also in the symbolism of the Ordo Dragones, the Order of the Dragon, in the 15th century, created by Sigismund of Luxembourg, that literally has that very specifically three-coiled or circled tail that is the meaning of the end time and the awakening of divine power. All right, across the entire spectrum, the entire dimension of the world, the heavenly as much as the chthonic, because everything revolves around this life and God himself. Roundness itself in Indo-European is the first visible sign of the divine. God is, in this sense, it's a geometrical metaphor for saying that every element, every part of God is even, is absolute. There is no angle, there is no fraction. As we've seen in the video about Agni Ignis, when the thunder strikes from heaven, from God himself, from Jupiter Pluvius, dominates also the thunderstorms. This has a fractal shape because it penetrates the world as it is imperfect, and therefore this sort of hypostatic instantiation of divinity takes the shape of the crevices of this valley of sorrow. Plenitude, in fact, is the meaning of roundness, like the suns. Celestial bodies is that contain a cosmos within the cosmos, like a seed, which, as you know, can overtake the entire universe from within. Even something smaller than a grain of barley within the human soul. The most ancient names for the wheel were spoken almost with the same breath in every branch of the family. Excuse me, I drank a little to properly pronounce. Sanskrit chakra, the wheel circle, the Hellenic kuklos, so the circle, the cycle. Kukleo, in fact, move in circle, as a verb. Kuklikos, circular. The Latin circulus, as we've seen before, circular, respectively circle, together in a circle, all from the Indo-European ka, the accomplishment of the circling motion. The accomplishment of the circling motion, not merely a motion or part of the motion, but the whole, the perfect round. The Proto-Indo-European term kvelos, wheel, circle, is directly attested also in Mycenaean Hellenic, kwekinomeno, wheel made. The Old Indic chakra, as we also already said, the Old Persian chakra, it's written in a different way, but the sound of the name is the same. Avestan chakra, in fact, the Old Church Slavonic kolo, that, again, you want to mention because this is medieval stuff, but that's when we know that the Slavs, already had this, obviously, from quite a while. The Lithuanian kaklas, neck circle, the Old Irish cool, chariot itself. So chariot could be, in and of itself, representing the circle. The Welsh kilk, circle, and the Tocharian B kokale, which means chariot as well. The same word that named the cosmic wheel carried by the sky god, Deus Pater, in his chariot drawn by the, and here we get also the other K, equus. You know what that means. It's the horse, right? So chariot, circle, wheel, horse go together. Same crane, by the way. You have the Sanskrit Ashva. This is the horse. And again, it comes from the hekvos. And here it's transformed already, but the root is the same. And it's very fascinating, by the way, that in the West, you see actually way more correspondence. You have the Avestan aspa for horse, the Latin equus, the Gaulish epos. So actually the Latin is the most similar to the original, as much as the Tocharian be Yak was not even too similar, but the Latin equus, even more than the Celtic epos, is stemming from the same root K. We explained before, the Roman knights circled around the pyre of the emperor during his funeral, the decursio, throwing their own decorations in the circle, because they were restoring to God the deified emperor as an eagle was free, a live eagle, of course, was free to circle around the pyre in heaven, which is also the symbol of the Holy Ghost and the accomplished deification. Right? The moon, the silver droplet that falls forever from the sky body and rises again, trailing the waters of life, because naturally it's the fastest, right, in these cycles that we witness to, was named Chandra, or Chandramas in Sanskrit. So literally the circling drop of shining water, right? This was understood in the Na, in the sacred word of the abyss, of the darkness. The blessed water, just like the one of the baptism, that in fact is transfigured, is shining because of the sun's reflection, and is in this sense like emerging literally from the darkness itself, right? From all their circle of waters plus Dra flowing. All right, so in other words, the same moon mimicked what the sun was doing, because she was bringing, like Artemis, and we'll see it better in the next video about the Olympians, that transfigured chthonic element par excellence, the most feminine essence, in fact, to a heavenly dimension, shining into the darkness. From the same can, the Hellenic-shaped centron, which means center spur, the Latin's centrum, center, the lunar name Menot, moon, month, is attested in the same way. Sanskrit mas, Hellenic men, Latin mensis, Old Irish me, Old Norse mani, Lithuanian meno, the Old Church Slavonic mesets, the Hittite armahi, all from the Indo-European me, which means what and why we're talking about this, because it means to measure by circling. Think about the agrimensura, for example. This was deeply connected, as you know, also properly with the moon, with the lunar cycles, was connected with the female cycle. It was all a ritual whereby the menstruum itself was used to render fertile the blood. And so in a way that was understood as auspicious, because of course here we're talking about the earth and what that had to yield. And so the symbol of the woman menstruating the moon having to do with this accomplishment, this achievement, because also that's when the woman becomes fertile once again, and that's the moment in which you should in fact ingravidate her at the same time. So it's very interesting, anthropologically speaking, to observe the overall sort of meaning and accomplishment of this measured by circling, right? There was probably a walk across the field that the man with his woman, menstruating woman, had to cross in the land. And this, interestingly enough, was also, this measured by circling was personified as actually the male moon god, Menot, who rides the night sky in a wagon exactly parallel to the sun's diurnal circuit. Hence, the actual transfiguration of the moon, of the most chthonic female element, into an actually virally led and chariot, again, that follows the same circular motion. And it's beautiful, as a matter of fact, as a theology. Time itself is nothing but the rim of that wheel grinding slowly onward. All right, the wheel of time is nothing but an illusion. Essentially, it seems like it's passing as things change in the becoming, only for those who actively degenerate. There is no such thing like time. I mean, I still haven't. I mean, any video about the traditional meaning of space, it actually explains time as well. And this is exactly the same concept, right? Time is relative. We know that very well. And it's the same meaning we've seen there before with Woden, with the fact that the youth is still lower and fears to die, etc. And he who has arisen through the ranks is truly divine and accomplished, and at that point, time doesn't pass for him. This is expressed by the Sanskrit, and it acquires naturally, you see, the entire calendarial meaning, exactly this wheel meaning, right? We know this very well. From the Sanskrit Kala Chakra, wheel of time, rolling without pause. Naturally, in India, this acquired some more chthonic dimension of even the sort of Pelagian character, this sort of constantly rebooting Mother Earth with sort of promiscuous regeneration, whatever. That is all baked as life with sort of a heavenly information, but it's still very, very pointless, very sort of, there is an end time in Indo-European mythology. It's not an eternally cycling thing. That is just but an illusion for those who do not understand what is in the axle of the chariot wheel. The Kala Chakra, wheel of time, that, by the way, rolls without pause, carrying souls from birth to birth as the sun's burning chariot rolls along the horizon. The Proto-Indo-European concept of eternal recurring time was in this sense not understood in a simple wheel-lock sense, because as we've seen, the point of it all is rather accessing through the wheel, right, by sort of being able to distract yourself from the circular movement and getting to the center where the order stands. And so actually an annihilation of time as such. So very far from the idea that, everything rebooted. That's a chthonic dimension, at least for the hero. The new age would reboot only once, ideal. And had to last for infinity just as much as we've seen God's plenitude allowed. Otherwise it means you had failed. In other words, you hadn't managed to bring order to the world, right? So every movement is actually connected with the becoming, which is coherent with the idea that the celestial movement is divine, because not just it is, as we've seen, inspired by the unmoved mover, but the only way to come back to the one is through movement, through something, because you cannot acquire that wisdom to sort of alter this time passing, because that's exactly our vision of time. So the more time passes, and the sooner you die, basically, right? And the Indo-European theology tells you that you're mortal just because of your fear of death, and therefore it's that entering in another dimension, all right, in the higher nature, that stops this all and makes this all meaningless, but an illusion. Think about the samsara. I talked about it, in fact, in that video about being and becoming, that is quite sort of specifically crafted to explain what this becoming is as a negative thing as opposed to pure being. But there is a word for this concept of eternal recurrence because of at least the idea of the return to the one that had, again, to stop the recurrence by being one without change. And this word is in Proto-Indo-European as a root is artus, which means the turning that returns. All right. And this, of course, has to do with the sunrise, the fact that this is a continuous incentive to the realization that even though this world constantly dies, it's possible to reboot it at some point, and to restore its primacy. The Sanskrit is famously the Rta. I made a video about this as well. The cosmic order of circling as a moth into the flame, right? The idea of self-sacrifice, right? And you can't attain divinity, but essentially committing a human sacrifice. The Avestan Asha, the old Persian Arta, the tight Ara, which means the right time. You have the Gaulish Are, interestingly enough, before in the turning, all from the same root as Latin artus, for example, which means joint, right? And the Hellenic artio, that means to arrange in circle, right? The joint, of course, was literally understood like the arm of the wheel of the chariot. And so the capacity of literally joining the extreme to the center. And so accomplishing, and because God, if you think about it, in this joint is the one whose arm is extended to the world, right, to the lower dimension. And so it's a double meaning of control, but always in a divine direction. At the still heart of every wheel lies the unmoving pivot. Again, God. We've seen this is expressed by the Hellenic kentron, the Latin centrum, the Sanskrit madhya, middle, really like the actual, also in the Germanic languages, the Hellenic mesos. The Latins actually had their own other term that stemmed from this other word that is medius, right? That is also the medium of divinity, because it was in the center. You see, that's also what the meaning of medium actually means. And all witness to the secret that the one who does not turn is the only reason turning is possible, right? This is a beautiful idea. It's basically the same notion of mortal and immortal. It's this eternal. It's the idea that everything is meant to be, but it's also left to will, right? There isn't such an opposition in tradition between free will or determinism. They are both true at the same time. Now, that unmoving center bore the name medium, middle, navel of the world. Sanskrit madhya, as we've seen, the Avest maidya, the Hellenic messus, the Latin medius, Old Irish mide, Gothic medius, Old Church Slavonic mejda, Hittite metani, in the middle, which is literally the root word also for metani, etymologically speaking, the exact spot where the world tree, the Doru verx, in probably Indo-European, the high working tree, stands, as we already explained. This takes the name in Sanskrit as Varksha, in Hittite Tarku. There are, see, Varksha, Tarku, it's always the K. Latin arbus, from, in this case, instead, herb with metathesis, and also, in fact, stemming from the original sound. Tree that pierces the sky dome as a stairway to heaven, and fixed, as we explained before, in the pole star, because again, if you look at the sky, the circle spins, but the star remains exactly where it is, in the center. All right, and this corresponds also to another root word, which is drugo, which means fixed. You find it in Sanskrit, dhruva, the Avestan drva, the Old Norse drugr, which means also firm, as a matter of fact. And so it's obviously a moral quality. It's nice that the Old Norse maintains this obviously sort of internal, spiritual, introspective almost a version of, of this light in the darkness. The eye, as we've explained before, is deeply connected with this, because the eye is the one that, as we've seen, is able to see the sky and the light in it differently from the nu, which is the denial, right? The darkness is this watery veil that you have to break through to get into that. And so what you see, our denial comes from literally the nu in their language, because it said, what do you see in the night? I say nu. That was not nothing, but it became nothing in our language, but it was like this very specific water that, as we've seen, is the one from which instead the moon, the sanctified water, the holy water, the blessed water emerges from to illuminate the night. And the eye is, however, also the eye of providence, and in fact is the one that is able to look beyond and to plasmate the world in fact, divine's image. It's like the eye of Rhine. That's what the hero can achieve to divinize. The eye is understood in part in Indo-European theology as a tiny black moon set in the face. This may sound strange, but the concept behind this is that the man can imitate God in their eternal watching, right? The eyes grant this projection into the world, so this providential capacity. We literally see what's going on, so we can't predict it even before it happens, right? Or as it happens. Sanskrit, chakshus, eye, literally, quote, that which moves, connecting everything around. This is incredibly important. Hence, vision and video, which is connected, as we explained before, also with wisdom. It's all one with the moral meaning. The Sanskrit chakshus comes from chaks, chashta, which means to appear, to see, right? Chakshana, appearance, chakshas, radiance at the same time. So it's all connected with the light and with the ray that emanates from a center, which is understood as divine as much as the spark within man. We also have connected to the aforementioned eye etymology the term tekmar, that stands for divine sign, tekmairomai, to discern by circling observation, because the eye does circle to an extent. The Proto-Indo-European term for eye is ok, and you find it in the Sanskrit akshi, the Avestan ashi, the Hellenic osse, which means eyes, the Latin oculus, the Old Church Slavonic oko, Lithuanian akis, Armenian akn, Tocharian ak, literally. And in the latter, you find perhaps the best, sort of more primitive root connection with the aforementioned ak that we're discussing today, which therefore conceives the eye as the circling seer, right? So it's almost personified in as we've seen in priesthood. Vus pupil, the koeklos, the little wheel, comes from it. Think about Keruleus as well. This was connected with the blue eye, with the azure sky and so on. And it meant little wheel as well. So it had to do with a circle. For example, more anatomically, the Latin pupilla is a term that stems from this interesting term, which is little doll reflected in the eye, which is a bit more astray. Then you have the old Irish kul, circle, we've seen before, mirroring the sun and the moon, right? And this is where we understand the Latin comes from, because it's like the ancilla, as a matter of fact. It's this side, as we've seen, of the curve of the sun that is reflected as the, here inverted a bit, like the sun in the moon, or better, the moon in the sun, because the sun is the eye, and the moon is seen by the sun as this smaller doll, so to say, that is just a reflection, a smaller hypothesis of the man. in that sense. This is incredibly important, also in the solar-lunar male-female dichotomy. Think about it. Light enters the pupil only by spiraling through its rings. The pupil widens in perfect circles when the soul beholds the numinous. And it's a bit like the moon. As we explained, she shines when she witnesses, she sees the sun that we can't see at that moment, but we can see the reflection of in her, right? So this is also quite fascinating. And love moves in the same rings, by the way. All the etymology of love comes from this circular movement. For example, to surround another with the warm breath of life is the Indo-European kan, which means properly to encircle with the breath / soul. We've seen also the root H, which sort of talks about the divine breath and is partly connected. From this kan derives the Sanskrit chanati, which means to love, to satisfy, to please, which obviously, as you understand, is understood in a religious sense towards God. But as we've seen, it's also true in this virile female relations, as we will see better now. For example, the Sanskrit kama, like in the Kama Sutra, it's literally coming from this, and it's love. And so we've seen what happens with the master and the servant. It's this separation, which is sort of metaphysical, so in its sexual meaning. And so, as we've seen, the Ancilla brings the sacred water to the master, so she's loving, satisfying, and pleasing him, just as much as we've seen the priest before circles around the altar to eventually give the offer to God. The root of kan is properly in Indo-European ken, which means to desire by encircling, right? And this is very interesting. If we haven't really gone on from last year with the series on Eros, as a matter of fact, but in some, especially Indian text, the notion is that the man should be immobile and the woman should do everything. I'm not kidding. It stems obviously as, you know, the hypostatic meaning of the aforementioned metaphysical relations we're talking about. It's the woman who is moving, and the man is, the sense, cold as ice, but still capable, of course, of creating new life in the process. We see this root ken in the Hittite kanesh, which means to love, but also to recognize, interestingly enough, because as we've seen with the pupil, like you see something greater that, you know, you're mesmerized by and you shine through, like the moon towards the sun. At the same time, the sun recognizes the moon, all right? And through the eye, which sees, and that, as we've seen, is understood as circularly moving, just like God. As we were saying, the Sanskrit kama means love. The Latin carus, which means dear, as well, is incredibly importantly connected with this. The old Irish karim, I love, or the old Norse hoena, which means to caress. The same love goddess Prithe, the beloved one in the European mythology, is connected to the aforementioned meaning. In Sanskrit, it's Priti, the Avestan Friti, the old Irish rat, which means grace at the same time. So grace of God is properly the result of being loved by God because of your virtue. This is what, for example, John means in Hebraic. That's actually my middle name, and that's why I like it. I didn't say what's my first name or my second one. I only told you I have a Hellenic, Jewish, and Germanic sort of nomenclature. In any case, grace of God comes from this concept. Has also the doctrine of transfiguration, literally embraced by light, by the golden aureola. We see the Gaulish Rithia in names as a suffix, even so as the beloved one, and even the teeth sort of remembers the motion in shadow, according to Indo-European Sanskrit kaura, thief, kaura, kaura, thievish, kaura, theft, kurania, stealing by circling stealthily, right? This has naturally to do with some predatory behavior that is proper. For example, if we mention war bands, the Latin curo, to care, also derives in any case from the this beloved loving embrace. Cura, which means care, curator, that is the guardian proper, and that is around in the circle, so to say, to veil on it. And remember the crane before. Think about the geese of Capitol Hill, right? That have the same meaning, sacred to Juno, right? And to defend from the thieves, so to say. And so it's double really meaning. Care and theft are essentially inverted forms of the same watchful encircling. In other words, they basically compare the positive and the negative direction of this circling movement, right? Which direction you go or don't. Because from one side you're circling towards the inner core, from the other you just actually spin out in a centrifugal fashion, right? It's a centripetal one that you have to follow. The Proto-Indo-European root kver, which means to make by turning, to make, remember, by turning, gives both the Sanskrit krinoti, which means to, like he makes, right? And the thief who makes away in Old Irish arakrin, that decays and steals, while the night thief, Nopot, Lord of Darkness, Sanskrit napad, Hellenic nepodes, Old Norse nöter, circles unseen, right? He's not seen because he's not embraced by the light. He's darkness, and so he's out of the circle, out of the reach of the Holy Ghost, right? It's not really out of the reach of God, because as I explained, God is sort of the premise of everything, but it's so edgy, literally, that it's pure darkness. Every seeker is a wanderer upon the wheel, interestingly enough. The wheel of life, and that's the point of it all. Also, some games in our folklore are simply derived from that. The geese path, those kind of things. They are actually deeply connected with this. Sanskrit charati, that we have seen before, it also means to move, to wander, to be busy. Charayati also means to cause, to wander around. Charitra means to conduct, chariot going about, charin moving. The Hellenic pelomai we've seen before means to be in motion, to circle. In all these sort of different semantic shades of sort of different sort of subsets of the same meaning. Polos stands, as we've seen, the axis as the vault of heaven. Poleo, to go about, to traffic. The Latin colo, as we've seen, means to cultivate by moving around the field. Colonus means settler, colonist as a consequence. He's the one who's properly set within this order. Cultor is the cultivator. Cultio is the cultivation. Cultura, cultivation, and especially of the mind. You see, that was the actual meaning of colo in Latin. It wasn't much about the agricultural, say the material aspect, of especially cultivation of the mind, as you've been able properly to sanctify the space and knowing how to handle that. Quaero in Latin stands for to seek, to search by circling, right? Hence our question. In fact, quaestio, search, inquiry, stems from the same circular movement, right? Circling around something. That's essentially what we do. It's not like we randomly search somewhere. We circle around an idea that we have to better define, that we struggle to reach this, sort of research kind of methodological sense is exactly what happens. The better definition, right? We literally can work this. This is how our mind works. Questor, the quaestor, as a matter of fact, was also a seeker, somebody who demanded, who tried to understand, to come closer to that. So that's the meaning of the famous Roman magistracy. all from the Indo-European car, which is to move all around. The same quell root produces the wandering sky himself. For example, Perkunos, as the root word, he is the striker who circles. This is literally the etymology of the Slavic Perun, the striker who circles. Right? It's the same concept of Zeus, of Jupiter, the same identical thing. The Sanskrit Parjanya, the Lithuanian Perkunas, the Old Norse Fjörgun, literally has to do with the same etymology, the same word in Indo-European. All circling the world oak with thunder, importantly enough, right? So we're thunderstruck, as we've seen in the video about the sacred waters. That's also where the divine life is able to regenerate the world, because the save from the waters is there emerging, as Romulus and Remus, Merovec, the entire tradition, telling us that it's from the darkest abyss that God can come, as we've seen, to claim the entire world. And this is the root of the Ficus Ruminalis as well, next to the Tiber water, and it's the same identical. It's the entire religion. They believed all the same thing. The shepherd circles his flock from dawn till dusk. The farmer circles his furrows, the spy. So the Sanskrit Chara, moving agent, wanderer, Charaka, wandering spies, circles the enemy camp. The guardian spirit circles the sleeping village. The sun at evening makes its final circle, the Charama, the last western, understood. I also made recently a video about, in fact, the Vedic direct cardinal directions regarding where sort of metaphysical the spirit of God, of the dead, etc., lie respectively, before sinking beyond the horizon. And the soul of the dead follows, interestingly enough, the same red path that is the path of the sun around the rim of the world. We've seen it just recently in the Indo-European heaven from Virgil's work. Right, there is this, at the edge of the world, this other world separated from the waters, unsurprisingly, where there are, everything is transfigured. That's the Elysium. That's where probably the Roman heaven laid, where everything was a golden harvest, the golden purpureal sheep, everything, even the lowest elements are transfigured, right? That western gate of the dead, and we will definitely come back. This is the Avalon, basically. There is an enormous stuff. We haven't even began to discuss this. Is understood as the winged west, that is the Ignis west, fire of the sunset, right? The Sanskrit Agnir Vish Vanara, the Latin Vesta itself, the Hellenic Hestia, the Hittite Asha, the heart axis, right? Remember that around the sacred fire, that is exactly the instantiation of divinity, the entire world revolved, hence the sacred fire Vesta in Rome, all right? We've seen this all being replicated across the entire Indo-European world. It's incredibly important. This is essentially the gateway to heaven. It's where the soul departs along the Milky Way, milked properly the Milky Circle in the European root word. It's very important because, as we've seen, the cremated hero ascends to heaven, also in the imperial funeral of the Romans. So this is where the sacred fire must be perpetually maintained as a literal stargate to the Milky Way. In Sanskrit, you find this term Kshira Patha connected with this Milky Way, the Milky Circle, importantly enough, which is also quite interesting, obviously also an astronomic geometry of it, if you look at it. The Hellenic Galaxias Kyklos, which is kind of evident. The Old Irish Sheeland, Path of Souls, interestingly enough. And you understand how horizontal, how sort of divaricated this is. It's properly the beyond. All right. Restlessness is the mark of the living. Sanskrit, chalati, to move, to tremble, to proceed. Chala, chla, always moving. Chalita, trembling. The Hellenic teleo, to complete, to fulfill. Telos, completion. Latin celer, swift, just like Romulus Celeris, by the way. That were horsemen, by the way. All they come from the Indo-European ka, later form of kar, the endless agitation of everything that breathes, right? Having this immanent force in them, right? So Keller, the swift, again, it expresses this beautiful spirit of the horse that, as we've seen, is also connected as spinning in circle to attain divinity through such military evolutions. You have the Sanskrit chayata, that is to go, to move, the Hellenic kineo, to set in motion, kieo, to go, kinesis, motion, kinema, movement, hence cinema. In Latin you have kieo, to set in motion, kio, to move, kitos, swift, concitare, which means to rouse violently, right? In kitare, to spur on, all from the Indo-European kai and ki, right? Blood wheels within the veins. That's what the Indo-Europeans believed. Thoughts wheel within the skull. Planets wheel in their appointed rings, right? And if you think about it, it's true. Think about the cardiovascular system. Think about how our neural circuits are interconnected, how the revolution orbits of planets work. This is exactly like a pattern, a path that we don't even technically know how it works at the end of the day. Well, it was what underpins it, and that was understood in ancient times as properly the sacred divine motion. Right? Probably much more accurately than any other moral scientific assessment we can make today. The 7 planets themselves were known as Aster, which is properly the star in Sanskrit, stir, the Hellenic Aster, the Latin Stella, the Hittite Hashterza, the Armenian Astel, all circling the pole star, right? That's why they were so important. Devos, the shining fixed one, was the fixed the pole star, and as such, the polar star wasn't understood as this fixed divine entity. Fear itself is born of reverent circling. As we've seen, there are also threats that can come circling, and recurrently so. In Sanskrit, we have the verb chayati, which means to observe with awe, to venerate, to fear at the same time. So that's the same concept of eternal divine love, but potentially also divine wrath. All right, it all has to do with how you relate yourself with God. You have chayu, which means reverent. In Hellenic, you have theo, which means to honor. Timao, to honor. Time, honor. Timios, honored, precious. Tina, to punish. Right, for violation of the sacred circle, obviously, because everything you do wrong fails, backfires, exactly just through the same divine power that destroys you. Destroys, say you're destroyed against it because you go against it in the moment. So he doesn't move. You actually get destroyed in that case. Whereas divine, the Holy Ghost emerges from the divine at every moment if you do the right thing and you come closer to him. So you're actually entering his orbit or his rays rather than even just the Holy Ghost simply descending on you. It's always mutual, it's always double-threaded. You have the Latin timeo, which means to fear, timor, fear, all from the Indo-European kai, to move in circle with careful attention, to honor, to stand in awe. Right, like, wow, I'm scared. If you look at the sky really completely, out of, isolated, without any anyone, right? It's scary. It seems as if you were falling to this immensity, this infinity, especially if you lay on the ground. The terrible sanction for breaking the circle is tem, which means to cut the circle. Right? In Sanskrit, it's tamati, which means is dark, right? Because you have literally cut your own connection with the divine. The divine is always there, but you have put the darkness in between because of your fear, your sin. Remember the timor here in Latin, for example. The Hellenic temno, which means to cut. So again, it's very interesting how they are interconnected linguistically speaking. The Latin temno, which means to despise by cutting off, literally. Thought is the slowest and most patient circling. Right? Everything that you learn by action is eventually to be processed in a contemplative sense, and that's where you get there. That's where, as you've seen, your restlessness of your actions, of your virginal, youthful rebooting gets mitigated by actual wisdom. Right? That's the mindset behind the Indo-European theology. All right. The Sanskrit chit means to perceive, to think. Chitati, to perceive, chita, thought, mind also, chinta, which is thought as much as anxiety. It all comes from the K root word. Chitania, which is consciousness. Equally, you find this hard K in the Latin scio, which is literally to know, right? Which is actually the meaning of science, which in this sense is understood as a process of continual encircling observation, hence scientia in Latin knowledge. So knowledge in the sense of I'm able to know, I have acquired this power. And the Hellenic kyklos, again, in the rolling of the mind around its subject until the hidden center shines forth. I can't wrap my mind around it, all right? It's like anomalous. It's there, but you just can't get to know it yet, right? There is something fundamental that underpins everything, and the absolute one is God. Like, not some Kantian anomalous can be everything to some extent, but that's another thing. Now, every cut is a completed circle. Interestingly enough, just like the circle of life. Right, we've seen what's the destiny in the afterlife for the different souls, whether they make it or not. And in this sense, there can be a cutting, but also instead at that point an adoption in the firmament, and so at least closer in heaven to the fixed center. In Sanskrit, you have again cha, is to cut away, chiati, chata, divided, Hellenic, scazo, to split, skiad, shadow, skene, tent, circle of shade. In Latin, you have seco, to cut, sectio, hence section, sector, cutter, so like the secutor. I made a video about that in Latin. Sexus, that is understood in this sense properly as sex as the primal section, right? Also the separation in that sense of the sexes in a metaphysical sense. The fact again that you need to recomplete the union, right, man and woman. Scio again also in the sense of separating truth from falsehood, right? There is properly a sense of separating wheat from the chaff from this, and getting through something, right? This idea of cutting is through the darkness, right, for achieving the light. That's also the best way of seeing that. It's obviously all metaphorical, it's all metaphysical, but still, right? You have the Sanskrit chid, to cut, to sever. Again, we've already basically seen it. For example, Latin scindo, to tear apart, schissus, torn, scissio, from which schism also derives, as a matter of fact. The primal cut that separates sky from earth, as we've seen also the male, the female principle, is connected with this. It comes from bel, to split the world egg, and it's connected actually to all these words are actually connected linguistically to the original root sound. You have the Sanskrit phalati, which means it bursts, the Hellenic fallo, to split, the Latin spallere, to split, the Old English spald, which is cleaving, essentially. The shadow is the dark half of the circle cast by light, right? If you are able to reunite this, you can essentially transmute the shadow into pure light. The Sanskrit chaya, shadow, reflected image, stresses this falsity, this sort of consequence of the fall, as opposed to anything tangible, like in the pure being of the higher nature. You have the Hellenic skia, which is shadow, skene, sky tent, skiadeion, parasol, by the way. The division of mankind into male and female is the first sacred cut that sets the great wheel of generation spinning. Right? This is probably the cause of motion as well, right? Because these two principles were originally united, and they are in God, in the higher nature. So it's quite interesting to see how this need for union actually underpins, just like love, the entire universe. Right? This is incredibly relevant. That twin division is remembered in the divine twins, the Divas the sons of sky, which is a bit also like the Dioskuroi, but there is also some deeper meaning there. We'll talk about in other there's another myths. In Sanskrit, you have the Vino, you have the Hellenic Dioscuro, you have the Latin Gemini, the Old Norse Alki, the Lithuanian Dievio Suneliai, right? All born from the splitting of the primordial ekvos, the horse, hence in the famous iconography of the Dioscuri, their appearance. We will talk about the Dioscuri because the meaning here is, I think, pretty ancestrally obvious, even though say, but there are different myths. The myths came later. It's not, you can't simply compare everything. There are different attributions also put later, but the primal principle comes from this original separation. And the Ekvos is the mare goddess who, the Hekve, as we've seen before, who births the twin dawn horses, right? So these are the twins that basically reboot as the reflection of the being and the becoming. One lives and deifies, the other dies as mortal, and they come from the same matrix, though, and so they show how the inherent potential of mankind at the start of their life, and therefore the different paths that the god and man follow, right? This restlessness of the horse that gives life again to both paths through the circling movement. Thus, from the first turning of the sky bowl above the primordial waters to the last footstep of the dying man upon the westward path, every motion, every glance, every breath, every thought, every act of love or theft or healing or cutting is nothing but a ripple, a spoke, a rim upon the one everlasting will, whose hidden center is the throne of the one who never turned, yet set all turning in motion when the world was young. Right? The creation was properly carried out according to tradition on probably in March, with the beginning of spring, of the Aitas, also later in a broader sort of warm season, right? That one is, of course, the Deus Pater, the Sky Father, that we find again in the Deus Peter, in Sanskrit, the Hellenic Zeus Pater, Latin Jupiter, Lyrian Dei Patrus, the Palaictias Papas, the Luvian Tatis Divas, all from the same Proto-Indo-European Deus, daylight sky plus Pater, Father. So the unmoving witness who stands behind the turning wheel while his son, the sun, performs the eternal circuit, right, with the rays connecting them. The same motion is remembered in every branch of the ancient kindred, for example, the Celtic druid walking sunwise around the Nemeton, the Germanic priest circling the blazing need fire 9 times. There's something coming also from, very recent folklore. The Slavic maidens circling the sacred spring with their wreaths, right, around the virile force. The Roman pontifex tracing the pomerium, as we explained before, so as a circle, so that the city itself may remain a perfect circulus herself, so representing the full plenitude of God, a reflection of the divine nature in this world. The Brahmin circling the altar fire before the hymn rises, the Thracian women wheeling in ecstasy around the possessed Thracian priest of Bacchus, by the way, and that's also sort of a very interesting vision, and one that, as you understand, is frenetically tied to that same movement we describe, the frenzy, this restlessness that is injected in being, and that do not know how to handle themselves, but are somehow still in contact with the divinity and resonate with that. The ninefold circuit is the archaic Indo-European hnen, 9, literally, the Sanskrit nava, the Hellenic ennea, Latin novem, Old Irish noi, Gothic noon, the Lithuanian devni, the Tocharian anu, all from the Proto-Indo-European root, noon. And this 9 times represent the sacred turning. It's the 3 times, 3 times, all right? And it's still preserved in the Hittite ninefold purification rites, as the Old Norse New Eimar, the 9 whorls around the axis Yggdrasil, by the way, that, as you see, also together with the circle, the concept of Midgard takes very seriously the necessity of performing the entire life, the entire cosmic order, not just also earthly rule, as an actually sacred rite around this axle of the Yggdrasil, that is the spring of all life. And again, that's amazing, really. And so what you realize at the end of this all is that all tongues, all rivers of men flowing from the ancient homeland carried the same memory in their blood. The world is a wheel within a wheel within a wheel, literally. All right. And the soul that learns to move in perfect harmony with the great turning at last reaches the unmoving center where the hidden one waits, radiant, silent, older than motion itself. And there are beautiful passages in European literature, also at much later times. Again, the end of the Divine Comedy is something, that illustrative about this. And it's not a mere sort of vision. Like, it's weird how we're presented this stuff as if they were not part of a notorious. Imagine what we have seen here today all together, reflected to, nobody told you in school about this, right? So you for example, end the Divine Comedy and you say, well, basically, yeah, this guy thought this stuff. This stuff was at the root of everything that the world had been. And so there is no obstacle, there is no divide. It's the same concept, and it could have not been expressed otherwise, right? And this was very close, like in a time like our Middle Ages, where everything is preserved in well enough compared to the ancient Indo-European times, when this concept were being transferred from God, not even forged, because that's also what tradition tells us. And so you have this image, this vision, the seeker who has walked the longest road around, discovering that he never once left the still point. That's yet another very meaningful concept of this all. When we make this celestial parallel, we immediately tend to reason in modern secular terms and say, oh my God, but the universe is huge. And yes, that does give a measure of the infinity of the effort and so on, but at the same time there is something metaphysically more comforting, namely the fact that if you're able to detach yourself from the illusions that you put yourself under as a superstition, you are able to obtain heaven here, right? That what surrounds you in this moment is just a product of your own vision, as mixed together with the collective consciousness, in a way that is sort of deteriorating the way we see, and that can be transfigured by merely passing on the other side, achieving a better, the full life, the eternal life, the absolute existence, right? Immortality, but as a declaration of life, where properly the concept of Mars is no more beyond the Mars Triumphalis itself, right? And in this sense, every circle was a returning home. And the end of all turning is the beginning of eternal rest in the heart of the one who set the first circle spinning when the world was young and the sky was still a greater semicircle of shining presence. I'm satisfied by this series because we somehow managed to cover at least very critical points of the entire sort of Indo-European theology. There's much to do about it. It doesn't simply end here. We have so many different theological concepts behind all this, but you understand how all rigidly coherent the stuff is, how you don't really find but a continuous recurrence, consonance, and paradoxically, it's not much. The objective of this series is not much to start from the principle and get into the further evidence mythologically or linguistically. Today, for example, we didn't insert much mythology because, in general, we could find plenty of the references to the same thing. But this was such a huge topic that we really needed to look at this in more strictly linguistic terms. However, the other way around is true. I mean, the best way to actually sort this thing out is not to fall into the presumption that it's only from later that we know. It's just by going back at the root that we know, right? And therefore, when you look at the words themselves and also their primal meaning, because you actually recognize your own same language in this, you can feel how close it is to our own understanding and vision of this word, because it's not like these words are used today in a completely detached fashion from the one that was at the time. Absolutely not. Actually, you can, by speaking, immediately understand this all, right? And as such, the best way to appreciate the existence of this religion and the coherence of its vocabulary, its religious sacred text, right, sacred word more than else, the logos proper, is to go back to that matrix. We have started recently a video about essentially hermetics, alchemy, and we've seen how that speaks a modern language that is so more diluted. Like in the Middle Ages, it was a bit more traditional. In ancient times, it was more traditional. In this prehistorical time, it was absolute. And that's what tradition also tells us, because that's essentially the meaning that we just expounded, right? And it's so absolute that that's where the idea that this is a sort of made up thing and that it can't be demonstrated or whatever, it's all complete BS, right? You actually find it as clear as day, really, in a fashion that can't be denied just by the sheer language as it expresses itself. And again, I don't think there is much else sort of at this point to doubt of this all. It's all evidently there, and it's all evidently explicit in this same language. And I don't think, again, it can't be really very much debated further. Do we want to debate this further? What does this language say? This language says exactly what we have just seen. That these are foundational words, of course, in Indo-Europeistics, and as foundational words, you understand, they are also the most important. This root sound is the most important of all, from which all the other descend. And you understand, by the way, that the same phonetics that we're discussing is not merely, let's say, there's this sound, and basically all the rest, that another sound is something completely different. For example, if you've seen in the video about the heart, the breath, the divine breath, and so on, the actual sense of that vital breath is the same one of the advancing sun chariot in the world, right? It's something more onomastic, it's only enriching the same foundational concept that I would think is what not just underpins. See, modernly we think all these various subsections. No, it's us that reconstruct the division right afterwards. We tend to simply think of this to be eventually how they actually thought at the beginning. It's the other way around. In the beginning, there was a single concept, and this is also incredibly relevant to the extent that if we deal with tradition seriously, we should admit that basically the most important principles were evidently more rooted than the others. Obviously, you could say because they were more important, and so they literally recurred in a more foundational sense. But it is slightly different, and it mostly comes from the sense that if tradition, as we think, was dictated, was essentially just the description of something coming straight from heaven, there isn't such a thing like a made-up. Like this is a language. This is what they spoke, right? So this is what they believed, and they could have not simply built at a table. Obviously, yes, you can say that in a society, the importance of the sun, the astronomic circles were very old, and so they could have evolved also from the bottom up. But the concept is so interwoven that it's not, in fact, something emerging above something else that lays in parallel. It's the entire architecture of this language that is solely permeated by the same concept. And so this really makes you think, because it seems mostly something truly derived from the above and not from the below. And this is a striking intuition. I don't know if it's been really ever... I mean, it's obvious if you enter into the sort of broader logic of this all, but it's also something not really obvious at the end of the day. It's not really being explicitated, and as far as I know, like the first time myself by recording this video that I listened someone saying this. And this seems to me, again, particularly relevant as much as actually potentially disturbing, because if this is true, it is something too big for us to have, unfortunately, and simply ignored. And I think we have to talk about ourselves a little bit, because this does not really sound a good thing to have ignored. To begin with, and that's also why I'm making these videos. I don't know how many people watch it or will watch it, because I see these videos normally get more views than the average, but at the same time they seem to me like they're very entwined now, and the more I make, of course, the more this is going to resonate, obviously enough. But at the same time, just remember, look, I will keep these online. I have them saved. I mean, if anything were to ever happen to the channel, and there are ways and ways to sort of to appreciate, to find this and to reappreciate. I mean, other ways. But what I mean is that this is original stuff. Like, this is new stuff. Nobody that I'm aware of has ever interpreted Indo-European religion in these terms. And actually, the more I turn around, the more I see people having some sort of strange attitude towards this, as if this was just a weird hypothesis. And literally, the language, if you go at the root of it, tells it all. And it's true that it's not so simple, I mean, in general, but if, again, you dig here in all the linguistic correspondences, there are scholars that are completely able to confirm all this. And as such, I don't think we need to add anything else. There is no doubt, no skepticism. It's rather something much more, I think, self-evident and, in this sense, expandable in a way that I think should be a bit more, more relevant, more appreciated. We'll see where we go with this, because again, it's not necessarily a matter of publicity, but it's rather a matter of, like, people at some point will understand what this is all about and probably grow a bit more sensitive to the whole matter. And at that point, we will have been, I think, the first to do this. And I think also from a YouTube video like this, you can simply copy what I'm saying. I know that AI somehow makes it easier and everything, but in general, the root, like the proof that this was before and that we came to this conclusion, I think, is the most important aspect. I really also hope that you're interested in this topic, because I find it incredibly fascinating. I am confident, of course, that we can expound this further, because we're a bit sort of at the beginning of the whole. And I'm glad that at least we got this from the cycle. By the way, we entrusted it to the sacred cycle exactly as the Indo-European religion prescribes. But aside from this, there is literally like an entire world to explore here, and it's simply not so arbitrary as we've seen. There is so much to know, and I'm really glad to have made this video. We will get there hopefully soon. We do it circularly, literally through the cycle, and we can absolutely continue this. But for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.